All right, so I'm Cal or Kalia, and I'm here with Jem. And Jem and I met not too long ago, um, and some of our first discussions did center around universal salvation, which obviously is a favorite topic of mine. But in the course of talking, I also learned that Jem has a background in philosophy, which was interesting to me because I'm sort of an amateur philosopher, but my background isn't there at all, even though at different times in my life I've given serious thought to studying philosophy. And Jem, if you don't mind sharing like what you do, my understanding is that you're a philosophy teacher among other things.
Yeah, I teach introduction to philosophy and introduction to ethics at a regional community college, mostly in person, but also online. Although it's been all online for a while. But yeah, so I have a master's degree in philosophy. So it's like, you know, a little bit extra beyond a bachelor's degree. I'm nowhere close to like having a PhD, like that level of expertise and specialization. Yeah, I've got a background in philosophy, you could say.
Yeah, well, and don't you wear a couple other hats in addition to that?
Yeah. I'm also, I work at a library, and I live on and run a flower farm and wedding venue. So yeah, a lot of, like, you know, 3 or 4 hats. Some people wear more hats than that. That's my number of hats.
Yeah. So what I thought I would do in this interview is sort of what I did with a few of our mutual friends. Just ask about your personal journey to faith and the particular kind of faith or theology that you ended up with. And in the course of answering this question, you can begin wherever you think the beginning is, and can talk about like just, I don't know, how you were raised or whenever you first became serious about whether God exists, or whether in your own mind you have determined to your own satisfaction that God actually exists, because some people are uncertain about that, even if they go through the motions. So anyway, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, it's been a lifelong process, really. Yeah, it's an interesting question where it started. I grew up, both my parents were theater academics. So my dad was a professor of theater, and my mom taught college theater, and she taught a bunch of other stuff too. She was an adjunct instructor like me, so she ended up teaching a lot of different things like speech and communication and stuff. And Dad was kind of a Buddhist for a while, and then he became a kind of an atheist, a pretty hardcore atheist. Mom grew up in a Christian family, and we went to church occasionally. But she continues to go mostly during holidays, because she loves to sing in the choir. That was always the big thing for her. So that was really, when I was growing up, I associated church mostly with choir, because I would go with Mom to choir practice and stuff. And I liked being in church. I've always liked churches, but I was never a Christian believer as a child. I remember, I don't know why this was a crucial moment, but there was one time we were coming home from church, and I got it in my head that, like, okay, I'm gonna pray with a lot of belief. I'm gonna pray that when I get home, every Game Boy game is gonna be laid out across my bedspread, like in a comic book ad. And then I got home and that didn't happen, and I kind of like just it wasn't that like my faith was challenged by that. I just kind of realized that I didn't believe in God. I was like, oh, that I'm not actually playing this game at all. Like I was maybe, I was like 7 or 8 or something. So I started telling kids at school that I didn't believe in God, because I don't know what it was about praying for Game Boy games that made me realize that, but it turned it into like I just knew I didn't believe in that, or that like it was like, okay, it was like I demonstrated to myself through that weird materialistic prayer that I wasn't a Christian. And so I started telling kids that, and I lived in Southeast Missouri. So when I told kids at school that I didn't believe in God, they were very shocked, and like they would whisper about it, I remember. And, that was kind of thrilling. And that really characterized all that I thought about religion for a long time. It was just sort of part of my identity as like a kind of an outsider amongst my peers. And in high school, I read the first half of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, which is the philosophical half. And then the second half is all about like all the terrible things that religion has been responsible for. And I swallowed that hook, line, and sinker without any second thought, really. Because I had stopped going to church with my mom. Mom never like made me go to church with her, but I always just went kind of out of obligation to her. Stop me if I'm bouncing off too many like weird, unrelated childhood memories, but I'm trying to locate the beginning of.
This is pretty typical, and the other thing is, it's like you said, sometimes the pivotal moments are central for reasons that we don't really understand. So I'm going to have to echo Peterson a little bit and say you have to let people talk. To borrow a phrase from Luke now, ahead of their head, just kind of bounce around and try to make sense of it, because ultimately, if this interview is successful, you will end up seeing something in retrospect that you haven't seen until now.
Yeah. Great. Good. Well, that's reassuring. So, yeah, I was a terrible student in high school, but I really started identifying with my intellect, and because I was relatively smart in my class, and even though I would flunk them all because I wouldn't do any homework, I was taking like physics and advanced chemistry and advanced biology, and I thought that I really wanted to be a scientist. And so I read The God Delusion, and I was like, okay, so I want to be a scientist, and I'm also going to be on this atheist team because this seems right. And it was really the only like thought about religion that I had ever been exposed to at all. Because like I said, like my mom's connection to religion was very kind of visceral and, well, and based on like beauty. And I didn't really identify with that. So my dad and I started having conversations about Richard Dawkins and The God Delusion, and about evolution and stuff. I really got interested in evolution. I still find evolution very interesting. But I really sort of crystallized an identity around that, especially because where I grew up, it was a very radical way of thinking. So I felt, I think, because I wasn't a very outgoing or popular kid, I got some satisfaction out of that.
I mean, this would have been in the 2000s, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, at that time, evolution was still sort of a flashpoint in the culture war, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah, I guess that's true. I don't really, I wasn't at all, like these days I'm so aware of like what those flashpoints are, like what those controversial topics are. Back in the day, I was really just responding to what was right there immediately around me. But it's interesting to think about like the cultural context of when the God delusion came out, because that was really part of this, like, I guess the new atheism, right? Which was like a cultural thing. At the time, it was just like I keep glancing over because the shiny silver cover of that book, I always remember it, and it's still on my shelf. I still keep it. But yeah, and it was very much like it was like, oh, this is going to be like I'm grasping onto the spirit of the new age of like emancipation from religion, even though I had never really had any experience with religion, really. I do remember I didn't like a lot of the things that I associated with Christianity, largely because like when you're spouting off about not believing in God, and not that I was doing that a lot or anything, but when that's the identity that you sort of put forward, what you end up getting met with is that same element in Christianity, which is, you know, people who feel very strongly that they need to talk to you about why you're wrong, and which is the addicting quality of that like culture war thing. It's like it's really like going to battle. And so I thought, you know, but there were things that made me sad. Like I had friends in high school who like a very dear friend of mine, when she found out that I was an atheist, she was just overcome with grief and started crying. And that was horrible. And I came to understand that it was because of her belief that because I wasn't a believer, if I died, that I would be suffering, and that was real for her. She was imagining that. So from early on, one of the things that repelled me about Christianity was hell, and what I saw the idea of hell doing in the minds of believers that I knew. Because I'm very, for whatever reason, I'm very sensitive to that. It really it troubles me, that particular kind of like suffering in the mind, like suffering from images. I find that really disgusting, and when I see people going through that, it really upsets me. And I think that's probably because I suffer from similar pain sometimes.
So was it the idea of hell itself which troubled you, or was it people's reactions to it, or both?
Because I never believed it at all, and I never understood why anybody was being taught that.
And so to an extent, for you, religion was like a source of needless misery because it's creating this like unnecessary psychological conflict.
Yeah, it's like, why in the world are children being told this thing that is called, like, because you see it in their eyes, in their face, like when they're having to see that stuff. Because I would ask my Christian friends, I would be like, so do you think I'm going to go to hell? And they would have to say yes. And just the expression and the cognitive dissonance, it was beyond belief for me. It was just so obviously cruel. And because I didn't have any kind of belief in anything like that, it just seemed so completely unnecessary. So anyway, because where I grew up in Southeast Missouri, it was most of the Christians who I interacted with, you know, belonged to fairly conservative traditions. and I think I maybe for a lot of them, I was really the only person who was at least like who was saying anything like, I don't believe in God, even if there were probably plenty of people who were struggling with belief. It at least wasn't something that you just said. And so the sort of the rebellious satisfaction of it kind of started to wear off for that reason, because I started to sort of see how much like it's a tender part of people, and it's also the source of a lot of real struggle and misery. And that changed my understanding of it a little bit. I still was very much interested in, I was like, okay, so, in college, I stayed in my hometown to go to college. And, I started a chapter of the Secular Student Alliance, and we were doing things like we would just set up a table outside with a sign that said, talk to an atheist, as if we're, what a great way to change the world. Really, it's just about, forcing people to listen to my pseudo-philosophical diatribes. But because I really wanted there to be like conciliation and like, if that makes sense.
To me personally, it's always made a lot of sense. The militant atheism. I know that must weird some people out when I say that, but what I mean is militant atheism is taking the question seriously.
Right.
And yeah, there might be a certain degree to which your own philosophical grandstanding or self-aggrandizement enters in, but that is equally true of,
right.
Apologetics, for example.
Right.
So, but on the whole, like I view militant atheism as something like a sane response to the question, even if it's based on false premises.
Right.
In my opinion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because that's, yeah. I think I tend to emphasize the sort of negative motivations that I always, when I'm talking about, why I did something. But there really was a sense that I had of like a wound that needed to be closed, because, a lot of blood was issuing out of it. And it's also like stuff my dad taught me when I was growing up about, like, because my dad, while he's very resistant, or resentful, or he has bad feelings towards Christianity in particular, but he taught me the biblical quotes that I still remember the most to this day, like before you point out the speck in the others, I remove the log from your own. He's a theater professor, and he'd always say log in a very like remove the log from your own. I can remember it very clearly, and that's always that awareness of like noticing somebody else's shortcomings probably means that like that I also have a bad problem, and like we need to figure out a way of helping each other, like through the like blindness. That was like, that little quote was like my moral universe, really. But like I thought of it as being like a very rational way of approaching things, I guess. Even though it's explicitly it's a biblical principle. But so I wasn't interested in changing my mind about any of that, although I really softened a lot towards, especially towards Christian people. And I felt really badly about, for instance, there was a traveling preacher who would come. He's a famous guy, Brother Jeb, or something. I think that's his name. He goes to college campuses, and his famous bit is he'll have an extension cord, and he'll show how the male end of the extension cord plugs into the female end, but the male end won't plug into the male end. And then he sings a song about how it's not okay to be gay. And he was sort of just like, people either hated him or thought that he was really funny. I thought that it was completely terrifying that this guy and his family are like traveling around with this like desperate message, and there's no, it's like he doesn't understand his audience at all, and his audience has absolutely no idea what's going on in his mind. Like, they might as well be like in completely separate universes watching each other on TV, like if that makes sense. And I wanted to like interview him and talk to him and his family, and I reached out to him, but I just never ended up doing it. I was getting really involved in the Secular Student Alliance, but then I was driving to some national meeting in New York, and I fell asleep at the wheel and totaled the car and very nearly died. And that was the last of that. So I never ended up really getting involved with the Secular Student Alliance. So, I think about that differently now that I believe in God. So I got interested in philosophy in college, really towards the end of my college career, because I kept, I wanted to be a physicist, I thought, but it turns out you have to do a lot of really advanced math to do that. And I didn't want to do the homework. And so I ended up flunking a bunch of classes. And then I got into biology or computer science or math. And it always was just too much homework. But in philosophy, I took a logic class, and I had a great logic professor. And I was good at that class. And it was my first sort of really positive, like, academic experience. And then I started taking philosophy classes, and it turned out that like I could basically just like sit around thinking for like a whole semester, and then like, at the midterms, focus for a day, at the end of the term, focus for a day and write a paper. And that worked out great for me because of my poor work ethic. So really that's probably why I ended up in philosophy. But then I got, but there's also, so again, there's me focusing on the negative part of that motivation. It was also like, I was interested in physics because like I really loved 2001: A Space Odyssey, really fundamentally. And the feeling that movie, the feeling of like approaching a grasp of like an understanding of mystery. And that was really, that's where I wanted to go with my life. But then it turns out that that's not really what physics is about. But philosophy kind of turns out is sometimes kind of like that. And so I got really interested in philosophy of mind, especially. I was really into the Churchlands, Paul and Patricia Churchland. I don't know if you're aware of their work and
Illuminativism.
Right. Yeah. At first, I was mostly
to explain to the audience briefly. It's some thesis that consciousness, or the subjective point of view, qualia, whatever you want to call it, is not necessary for a complete factual description of reality. Something to that effect. Right. Well, yeah, and also that their point. So the two things that really always fascinated me about them, Paul Churchland especially has published or he did in the 90s, some of the most compelling
illustrations of this debate in cognitive science between like the connectionists and the classical computationalists. The classical computationalists kind of believed that the mind is kind of like a classical computer program with an algorithm. But the connectionist movement, and I don't know how relevant or I know that cognitive science has kind of moved on to like dynamic systems theory and stuff like that. But the connectionist idea was that the mind is represented in the brain in a distributed way, like through a neural net, where unlike in a classical computationalist system, it's really hard to say like where each part of the mind is really being represented. It's all sort of represented in this shared massively distributed network. And that I found unbelievably interesting. And so I got interested in, and for that reason, they believed that like things like beliefs and desires, these like psychological concepts, will eventually be eliminated in the sciences in favor of something else, which I still think is a very interesting idea. I don't think that the way we think about beliefs and desires, I still think of those ideas of belief and desire to be kind of crude ways of thinking about our minds, really. But I really that's stuff that I was interested in a long time ago. I don't remember all that much about it. But so I got really interested in the mind, in the philosophy of mind, and in cognitive science because of that overlap with sciences. It was a good kind of gateway drug to go from the sciences to into an area of philosophy. I always wanted to be an academic of some kind because my dad was, and I liked the lifestyle. Not that it comes with a lot of money, but you do get, it seemed like a very humane occupation, just teaching classes and working at a school, never ever leaving school. It's so strange that that's what I wanted, given what a terrible student I was. But so I went to grad school. I went to Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I love Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was a lot of fun to live there. But there weren't really any, so the program that I went to, I'm trying to think of what like the salient parts of this part of my life are, but there were no philosophy of mind people in this program, really. No specialists like in cognitive science or anything. It was a very small department. For a terminal master's degree program, it was reasonably well thought of. But I never really ended up learning that much about like contemporary issues in cognitive science or anything. I ended up just kind of focusing on my own on consciousness, like through David Chalmers, primarily. But I did end up learning a lot about the metaphysics of modality, so like possibility and necessity and stuff. And that's an important part of the story in a moment.
Yeah, because Chalmers was basing his arguments about the metaphysical nature of consciousness on intuitions about modality, and he was probably really drawing on the work of Kripke and possible world semantics. So this idea that I can imagine some possible world in which consciousness does not coincide with brain activity, and therefore that means that consciousness must not necessarily be physical. And if it's not necessarily physical, then that means, like based on some kind of axiom S5, possibly necessarily is necessarily something like that, then it is not physical. It was some dubious logic like that, but it was very influential, and I'm not entirely sure that it's wrong. Um,
No, I'm
but
not entirely sure
it's
about
not the way I would go about proving
any.
it myself. And I'm probably mischaracterizing his argument a bit, but
No, that was
but
very good.
it's crazy how, see, I haven't said this yet, but as you're going through your story, I guess it's because you and I are the same age and in some general sense, like same demographic, but I have an unusual biographical or autobiographical detail myself, which is that I was raised Hare Krishna. I was raised in a
Right.
very insular community with a very different religion, but I lived in the same time and place as you. And man, there is so much stuff between your story and mine, which is parallel. Because at the same age as you, I was very much interested in the same topic. From a very materialist point of view, which was inadequate to explain consciousness, but not really for the reasons that I think Chalmers thought or still thinks. But I've never really done those philosophers uh, uh, full justice. I've never actually really knuckled down and read what they
Well,
said.
yeah, and the thing to say positively about Chalmers is that he's, at least up until his book The Character of Consciousness, which was the last, which he wrote I think in 2011 or 2010. He's very agnostic about like what the issue means, but I mean his real contribution is the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which is the point, which really the point of that is just pointing out this gap, like, which again, sort of going back to the feeling that I had about this wound that was open that needed to be closed. It's a manifestation of that same thing. It's like there's one element of culture, in this case philosophical culture, which says we are done with the mind or the spirit or consciousness because we have a complete physical explanation, which, whatever, that's a delusion anyway. It's not even true. We have a complete physical explanation of the universe. But
We had a lot
and
of
then the
people
other
who
side
wanted
of,
to pretend that we did,
right,
Dennett
right.
and the Churchlands, and I'm sorry. See, that's what I said. What I said earlier. I don't know if this was recorded or not, but when I'm very interested in what my guests have to say, that's when I butt in. So I shouldn't. But
No, you're right.
You're talking about Chalmers took a stand and he said, no, I think this is actually a problem. We have to take it seriously.
And the crazy thing about it is it's really just an observation of an enormous gap. Like, here's where one side's explanation stops abruptly without continuing, and then there's a big gap, and here's where the other side's explanation stops abruptly without any explanation. So you can take consciousness as real, and move with it as far as you can to a point where it is trying to meet up with the physical explanation, but it never gets there. So there is this explanatory gap. And I mean, the really startling thing about his point of view is that it's like, well, here are the reasons to expect that this is like an unbridgeable gap, at least in the terms that are available to us now. Like, there's no physicalist terms that can bridge this gap between the physical explanation and the existence of consciousness.
I guess that whether or not there is that unbridgeable gap, it depends a lot on the assumptions that you're coming to that question with. And I don't know if philosophy is still like this, probably is, but at that time especially, it was really based a lot on intuitions. And what Dennett satirized is intuition pumps. It's like I have this intuition that
right,
such and such, and oh, but I have this intuition, and if I can imagine some world in which they're separate, that means they can't be identical. Well, if they were identical, would there be a reason why they were identical? Is there a reason why my hand is my hand? If I ask that question, it's like I'm starting with the assumption my hand is my hand. Why is my hand my hand? Implies possibly my hand is not my hand. But wait, I began with the stipulation that it is. So it's like, unless I
Yeah,
rule that thing
it's
out from the
it's the reason why there's never been like a solution to the problem of the freshman intro to philosophy student, because fundamentally it's all of philosophy is reliant on some intuition pump. The first principles of and this is an opinion, it seems like an inescapable problem of philosophy, that it's
no,
like,
I mean, and I remember reading a paper.
oh, Cal, I lost your audio completely. Oh, it says you're connecting to audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
If there was no reason for that error to happen. But I was going to say, no, I mean, I think the point was made by this guy named Yablo in a paper I remember reading. It's like, you're going to undercut conceivability as a basis, for your uh, conclusions about the metaphysical nature of consciousness, physical or not physical. In the end, you only have conceivability itself with which to do that. And so that is kind of like, if I'm going to go after intuitions, a lot of the time it's, it's drawing on the same kind
Yeah,
of that.
but then it needs to, and he's a brilliant guy, I guess, that's the consensus. But like, he very clearly wants to just be clear of all that stuff. He wants to be clear of consciousness and its mysteries. He wants to be clear of the issues of conceivability and intuition, and not be troubled by the fact that they have to be there. That it's actually, you just have to sort of rewind your thought process up to the point where it's relying on a basic like issue of conceivability or intuition. Because if you go that way and start to kind of dig around at what intuition or conceivability are, you end up with some very strange things that don't seem as like solid and ordinary as a scientific explanation. And I think that there's terror about that right now in general in our culture.
Would you say that Chalmers and his ilk basically won the day in that particular?
That's my feeling about it.
I feel like
I've been out of touch for. What was that?
I'm sorry. I feel like the philosophical zeitgeist is headed more strongly now in the direction of panpsychism.
Yeah.
And I think that Chalmers and his friends were pretty influential in
completely. Yeah.
So I think at the end of the day, they won that debate, at least as measured by the direction that everybody wants to go now. Right. Whether or not they did so with valid arguments is, my sense is they had invalid arguments, but they had the right conclusion. But anyway, that's just my opinion. But at any rate, it looks like they won the day, and that there is the sense.
Yeah, I have that sense too. And when I hear David Bentley Hart talk about how panpsychism is in vogue, that seems like the trajectory that things were sort of generally headed in. There was, when I was in grad school, there were generally like a handful of fairly stodgy people like Jerry Fodor, who were kind of, or Daniel Dennett, who were kind of still trying to defend it, like what was pretty obviously becoming an outmoded way of thinking about the mind.
Baby boomer materialism.
Yeah, exactly. And now I guess things have moved on. It's interesting. And you brought up panpsychism. I Even when I was still in college, I don't remember what exactly caused this, but I suddenly thought, well, it's obviously it's going to turn out that like the solution to this problem is that consciousness is in some way like just ubiquitous. Um, and I was really interested in panpsychism. I was working on my writing sample for PhD programs was going to be about panpsychism, and I really, but I mean, unfortunately, I guess I didn't really. There was nobody on the faculty who was really interested in that particular. One of my favorite professors in grad school knew plenty about the metaphysics of that issue, but I was really just kind of working on it on my own. But it's so interesting to see now that like it was an idea that was, because I thought that it was a very unpopular idea. In fact, the only defense of it that I ever read was in grad school. Galen Strawson published this paper called Consciousness and Its Place in Nature, I think, which is really, in all humility, I'm not putting myself in judgment of Galen Strawson, who's been an accomplished enough philosopher, but it was really bad paper, and really very poorly written, I would say, compared to his other work, even.
Was it arguing that consciousness has a place in nature, essentially?
Right. Well, I mean, he was arguing against. He was arguing that a version of panpsychism, his version of panpsychism, was really the only possible physicalist way of finding a place in the model for consciousness.
I remember there were a lot of attempts to sort of unite physicalism with an essentially anomalous, and basically non-physical but semi-physical conception of consciousness, like Donald Davidson's anomalous monism. The idea that we can say, well, consciousness doesn't reduce to anything physical, and yet it's related to the physical via psychophysical laws, which are, even if not physical in this or material in the strictest sense, they are physical or naturalistic. And there's the bridge. That's how we can tie these two things together. But I
Right.
remember I wasn't buying it. I thought
Well,
it has to reduce to something material in order for it to be physical. But that was just me at the time in my early 20s.
it just starts to become kind of obvious to me that we're just trying to like use the physicalist terminology and hold on to it while still, it looks like we're trying to have our cake and eat it too.
A philosopher that I really like, and I'm sure other people have said this, but a philosopher whom I really like, who is really obscure. It's like you wouldn't have heard of him. He's super obscure. No, I'm not trying to be a philosopher hipster, but this guy is, for whatever reason, very he's always been outside of academia. His name is Chris Langan, and he's very controversial in terms of his political.
Yeah, he's your main guy. I know.
I don't agree with all his views, but in metaphysics, he's pretty impressive. And he said, like, basically all this stuff was it, what we were talking about, like the attempt to assimilate an essentially non-physical consciousness into physicalism. This is just a recapitulation of Cartesian dualism. And it's like pretending to make progress. We never actually made progress. We're going to call it property dualism rather than substance dualism, and imagine that there's a difference. Well, even Descartes never imagined that his substance was, spatio-temporal. And if you have or at least not spatial, and if you have a non-spatial substance, how is that meaningfully different from a property to begin with? It's like, right. It's made up pretend progress in place of they haven't gotten beyond Descartes. And right. They're putting Descartes before the horse, if you will. Sorry.
That's terrible. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I probably agree with that.
Those some of my own ideas intermixed with Langan. All Langan said was that they're just basically recapitulating Cartesian dualism.
Yeah, I thought that the solution might end up being just sort of admitting that all physical properties are properties of consciousness. Like that was the form of panpsychism that I really found compelling.
Yeah,
Because
you
it
have to
just seemed
do
to
an
me like
inversion.
what's that?
You have to push the question inward. You have to turn it all the other way around. You got to, instead of reducing mind to physics, you have to reduce physics to mind. You know, like that's kind of
Right
where we
there,
have like
yeah.
Donald Hoffman now. You know, like with his
No, I don't
oh,
know.
okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, but yeah, I mean, like that's kind of the direction that like the philosophical consensus went. It's like we have to turn this whole thing around. We have to stop.
And it's kind of obvious because it's theoretically unlovely to have a dualism. David Bentley Hart says, it's a play on nature abhors a vacuum, but it's like philosophy abhors a dualism, which is very interesting that that's true. But the thing that I was beginning to find kind of frustrating about the whole field was how everything in the end in the sort of metaphysics of mind in the analytic tradition comes down to like questions about like theoretical virtue, parsimony, and now that I'm thinking back on it, it wasn't because it's like we need to bring consciousness into our metaphysics, and but like with consciousness needs to come like humanity and like the personal like existence of human beings. And really I what I came to realize is that I was very I was never really very invested in the whole analytic philosophical game at all. It was almost kind of like the moment where I realized that as a kid that I wasn't a Christian. It's like I'm not really playing this game with my heart. And I met when I was in grad school for some reason. There were a lot of Christians in the program. And I think maybe I think it's probably quite common for very intelligent, analytical Christians to go into philosophy. It's a natural place. But like my office mates, I had my two office mates. One was this a German young German man who was Christian. He believed, amongst other things, that it was always morally wrong to break any law, which was which is a very German way of thinking. But anyway, I'm in my mind I'm reminiscing about. I have very tender feelings towards all these people. Kolya, but and so my office mates were Christian, and the close friends that I made there were Christians too, and they taught me a lot of things, partly just by never ever really engaging me about religion at all. We were quite close friends, and when I would ask them questions about their belief, they would talk to me, but I never felt any kind of pressure of any kind from them, and we just became very close. And they would go through things, and I would see them living their lives. And I started to understand more about Christianity just by being exposed to them. It always almost reminds me of, I don't know where this observation comes from, but that in ancient times, in the early church, communities of Christianity were, it was noteworthy to pagans how much they loved each other. And that this was sort of what set them apart in people's minds. And I had that experience with them. And my friend Cameron, I asked one time about hell, because it was always on my mind when I was talking to Christians, because it just seemed so, like, I couldn't imagine living with that idea. And he was the first person who told me, some people believe in eternal conscious torment, but there are a wide variety of beliefs about hell. And some people, in fact, believe that nobody ends up permanently in hell. And I honestly didn't really know that at all. Nor was I really aware that there was really like such a depthful tradition of Christian thought. I had a very shallow understanding of, like, I thought Christian intellectuals were essentially just like creepy people who were trying to make up like arguments and reasons to like keep believers entrapped, and to lure.
We came from a background where the only public Christian intellectual whom we really saw was like William Lane Craig. And what's William Lane Craig's response to the question of the fate of the unevangelized? What about all those Chinese people who never heard about Jesus, prior to the year 0? And he just said, well, blah 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 Molinism, and maybe what if God providentially arranged things so that everybody who would never believe in Jesus, if they heard about him, just was placed in times and places where the word never came anyway. And so like it was this very sort of, if you'll pardon the expression, it was this really ass backward cart before the horse, seeking reasons to justify what was morally strange, rather than offering alternatives to the moral strangeness.
It's just like Daniel Dennett just is sitting there and kind of just waving his arms around and trying to cast a spell.
It's the other side.
It's
the same worldview. It's just on the other side of the fence. That's almost word for word a David Bentley Hart quote. Like that William Lane Craig and Daniel Dennett, they're like in the same thought space. They're in the same religious universe, but they're just on different sides of the fence.
That's very interesting. Yeah. You're exactly right. It's funny. I had a class. One of the famous, quote unquote, famous or well-known members of the faculty was this guy who had he was interested in the philosophy of physics. He was a real expert on cosmology, but he had this long debate in print with William Lane Craig about cosmology and religion. And so I took a course from him where we went through this book, which was just all their back and forth. And essentially, well, I don't remember a lot of the argumentation, but man, it was real far away from anything I consider to be religion now. But unfortunately, that faculty member has now passed away, and he was suffering from madness. I don't know what his diagnosis would be, but I drove him home one time, and he, in order to locate his apartment, he had to leave a bright orange trash can lid in the window. And because it was after dark, he was having trouble seeing it. So I was just driving around this apartment complex with him trying to find it. And there was something, I don't know, emblematic, or there was something so striking to me about that class and that experience I had with him. Just the desolation of it all, and the lack of humanity. And one of the things that William Lane Craig seems to insist upon is, like, God knows what's going to happen, and this has all been set in stone as the plan from the beginning. I know that that's probably a misrepresentation. I'm talking about an impression that
it's not. It's. I mean, I think that's basically correct in the sense that as a Molinist, William Lane Craig believes that God has the so-called middle knowledge. He knows everything that would happen if.
Yeah. Right.
So yes, everything is known in advance.
Right.
Human freedom is part of the equation, but it's the same as like me knowing what a toddler is going to do. My knowing what they are going to do doesn't theoretically reduce or eliminate their free will. Nonetheless, it's like I know everything.
Right.
And yeah.
Right. Yeah, because that was really the crux of part of the argument of that book, was that Quentin, my professor, he was arguing that because a singularity, in principle, what arises from a naked singularity in the universe is in principle unknowable. That was his key argument, that it would be a completely irrational choice for a creator of a universe with some goal in mind to choose a Big Bang singularity, because it doesn't matter what your plan is. There's very little chance that what comes out of the Big Bang in terms of the physical laws of the universe and the physical history of the universe is very low probability that you'll get what you want. And then Smith, rather William Lane Craig, essentially engaged him on that point. And their debate was about whether it was essentially possible for God to have this middle knowledge that you're talking about. With Craig sort of insisting, and I don't remember the technicalities of it, but to me it was just such a. I mean, the idea now to me of a way of looking at the universe that could be incompatible with, like, that sort of creation. It just seems like it saddens me to think about God in limited terms like that, like somebody rolling marbles, or like somebody who, like starts things off like a Rube Goldberg device.
That's excellent. Yeah.
And then having that experience with my professor and his state of mind, it informs some of the ways that I feel about the products of analytic philosophy, this way of thinking, and I got out. It's maybe not one of the reasons why I got out of that field, but I didn't feel good about the direction. I no longer felt drawn in that direction.
I think you're almost being too kind, or being too charitable to analytic philosophy, because I mean, I'll say this, it's just my own opinion. There's like nothing more cursed than that. All those symbols, all that appropriation of math, and the appearance of rigor. And at the end of the day, yeah, it's like it can be about the most consequential subjects imaginable, and yet manage to completely miss the point, like what you're talking about with like the back and forth between Craig and Quentin, but and the heartbreaking story of his dementia. Now, like, if you want a real argument against God's existence, take the existence of dementia.
Yeah.
Because everything else, all the other suffering I can justify in terms of moral growth. But if one's whole sense of self and narrative itself breaks down, where is the repository for that moral growth? Like that, entropy can be justified with reference to a kind of moral progress of, the psychological subject, which is like it's like a narrative line that can be vectored out of this space-time and into some kind of higher dimensional spiritual reality. But if 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 what's happening here, in the entropy of the space-time continuum itself is unraveling and it blowing away like dust, the mind, whose moral growth is supposedly the objective of this entire creation,
Right.
what then? And it's
Right.
like that's a real argument, and it's like that's a terrible contrast too. Like you've got like this whole much ado about nothing kind of fake, or at least like irrelevant
Right.
technical exchange. Then you're also driving this guy home, and he's looking for the giant. I mean, like that's that's terrifying.
Right. It is terrifying.
That will take your faith in God.
Yeah, and it was yeah, it's very tragic. But so I and the other person that we studied, that I ended up studying a lot, even though I was never interested in this subject, was David Lewis, and his On the Plurality of Worlds. His
He was a
Louisian
fascinating
modal realism.
madman.
Yes. And I mean, I didn't realize how relevant his work was going to be for me moving on, but I ended up learning a lot about modal realism and how compelling it is, really. I mean, from an analytic perspective, that book On the Plurality of Worlds, it's almost, I feel like it's the highest accomplishment of analytic philosophy in my limited, admittedly, limited exposure. But he takes essentially the principles of theoretical virtue and convincingly argues that everything conceivable is as real as what we experience as reality.
Yes, and he said that actuality is a dexical relation, such that in our actual world,
Right.
It's actual to us because we're here, but to the denizens of a possible, what is from our perspective a possible world, their world is actual,
Right.
and to them, and so it's a kind of it's a relative thing, and he held that
Yes.
there's like a real sort of actually existing infinity of possible worlds.
Right, and it's even more explosive in its ontology than like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. According to the many worlds of interpretation of quantum mechanics, it's just kind of like a spilling out of all the possibilities that might have happened in a world like this one. But
there was this really obscure old school philosopher. His name was Alexius Meinong, and Meinong said, like, if you have the concept of the golden mountain, that means there's the golden mountain. Like it exists outside the mind in order for you to have that concept.
Yes,
it's much more like that than it is
right.
Even like the already explosive ontology of many worlds.
Right, but like theoretically, a very useful in analytic philosophy. It's a very useful theory, but morally, it's unimaginably hideous and nullifying. Because I mean, there are infinitely many worlds where you and I have this conversation, and it's productive and it's a nice world. Like even in many of them, it's a improbably nice world after this. This podcast becomes a global phenomena, just completely unaccountably, and we get to decide, world government issues from now on, you and me. So there's many great worlds like that, but there's also, for every great world like that, there's a world where just unaccountably, like this exact moment in the conversation, we're just plunged into meaningless, endless suffering and confusion. There's like, we have clown makeup on just instantly for some reason. There's infinitely many worlds like that. There's infinitely many worlds where everything happens. Like there's absolutely no constraint on what is real.
And some people think that the many worlds interpretation of like quantum mechanics leads to what you just described, because the number of universes there is theoretically infinite, and so it must embrace every possibility. But if you're sharp, you'll notice that that doesn't actually follow. That, you know, there can be a set which is infinite and yet excludes systematically many things. Like the set of whole numbers is infinite, and yet it excludes all fractional numbers. So it's not just because the set is infinite that it truly encompasses or contains every possibility. However, in Lewis ontology, you would get absolutely everything crazy like that.
There would be an uncountably infinite. So there are countable and uncountable infinities, and there would be an uncountably infinite plurality of worlds in which not just everything. So there are worlds of nomic possibility where it's like everything that could happen given the physical laws of this universe, but it's far, far beyond that. What he's talking about. He's talking about anything conceivable, anything. And there are even some philosophers who argue for realism beyond that, where it would include the reality of impossible worlds as well.
And the problem with all this, you know, from my standpoint, is if you say something is real, you know, reality as a predicate, I'm kind of parrot Langan here a little bit, however, unintentionally, but you know, reality as a predicate would be defined on its complement. To be a little bit Wittgensteinian here, you know, if there's only right and no wrong, then that means you don't have either one. And so, you know, if absolutely everything is real, including the impossible worlds, then suddenly the word real doesn't mean anything anymore, because there's no complement for it to be distinguished against. But also, just like from the moral lunacy standpoint, it's like if there is a God, and he's allowing all this wacky stuff to be real, one would assume on sort of humane grounds that, you know, he should not allow certain worlds to be. And yet, you know, for me, that gets into other areas. But I'm already interjecting a lot. But I guess at this point,
well,
what
yeah,
I would
but
ask is like how did your Christian friends, and how did your exposure to these sort of more rarefied philosophical ideas, what role did that, or what effect did that have in terms of, if any, in terms of leading you to believe in God, where before you had always been sort of habitually or reflexively an atheist?
Habitually, yeah. It ended up being very, like, concretely, in a very strange way, relevant later on. Like modal realism, I was never really a modal realist, I wouldn't say, but I had a very good friend who was a Christian, Cam. He really got into that stuff, and I don't know if he ended up being a Luigi modal realist or not. I was just alarmed that Luigi modal realism alarmed me, because it's like, I mean, if I become a modal realist, the next time like I give a homeless person change, I have to also acknowledge that, like, in an infinite ways, I am simultaneously, or my doubles in an uncountably infinite number of ways, are humiliating, killing this person right now. Like, every particular of my life is only like one of the necessarily existent variations on, and like,
I mean, if philosophy leads to this, you know, like this is the true terminus of philosophy, as dementia or madness. Like now there is no more reality criterion. now everything is just unintelligible. It's just devolving into this pure static or white noise of, because like absolutely everything is sort of is like it's like both X and not X, which is like logically equivalent to neither X nor not X. It's where the infinity and the void sort of become
Yes.
similar. And
Yeah.
and like that's a really horrible terminus for
Well,
philosophy
and
to
there's the
arrive
idea
at.
that we would be arguing about that
But it also
and
blows
not
away a lot of all the baby boomer like materialist
right.
assumptions that one started with.
Well, and how can you sit in a room and argue about whether or not my infinite doubles are cruelly murdering, all my friends and family? Like, how can you sit in a room and argue about that without screaming and tearing your hair out and 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 losing your mind? I mean, because that's really what it all means. Like, at the end of the day, we all leave the conferences and go back to our hotel rooms and try to sleep as just, little baby boys and girls.
We take our antidepressants, we drink our IPA, and we watch Rick and Morty, right?
Right, right. It's a nightmare. And I think
it's wild.
my
Yeah.
impression is that for David Lewis, it was a nightmare. He wrote a paper called "How Many Lives Has Schrodinger's Cat," which is actually about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And he and it's been many years since I looked at it, but essentially he says, well, if this interpretation of quantum mechanics is true, it's possible that our consciousness, our experience of this will be, so our consciousness continues on through this world that we inhabit until we reach a point where we might die. But obviously in those worlds, our consciousness doesn't continue. So we continue on in the worlds where we remained consciousness in that history of the world. And this just goes on and on and on to the limits of the possibility of the physical laws. So, just by quantum thermodynamic miracles, your body and mind will survive the death of absolutely everything else until you are the last inhabitant of a world dying of heat death. And this is the point of
This
view,
is
I
like
think.
almost indistinguishable from a psychedelic trip.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
but like I mean, like it's a great example. Like in my own case, I know there was a time, I mean, it wasn't very long ago. It was about a year and a half ago when I was experimenting with psychedelics and trying to find some way out of my materialist categories into, like what I could into some rationally comprehensible, like understanding of the afterlife. Was there anything like that for you? Or did it always remain sort of, shall we say, uh, uh, sober and straight-laced, and purely rational? Your pursuit of
I have, for
philosophy.
whatever reason, I have very rarely ever had feelings of anxiety about my survival. Um, like beyond death. For other people, I think it's because I'm still very much a child in that part of my mind, and it's just my own death is still inconceivable to me, to the point where it doesn't really exist. But the death of other people exists for me, and I have anxiety for them, and I try, like, I would think, well, at a certain point, computation will become so perfect that it will become possible for a computer to rewind time and perfectly simulate a person who has long since died. So it's guaranteed that my mom and dad will one day live again. And even if they suffer in death and despair, a computer god will inevitably arise that can bring them back.
A lot of people believe this now, or transhumanism is like their religion, and this is not also different from Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return. It's itself probably really fallacious, but like The amount of matter in the universe is finite, and yet time is infinite. Therefore, at some point in the future, everything that is now
Right.
must be recapitulated again.
Right.
Or, theoretically, in an even better form or way than it was when it, well, while it's happening right now, or when it first came into being, if time has any meaning in this sort of scheme. But let me just ask you, do you believe in God rationally, or is that something that you feel in your heart, or neither?
I believe in God as my friend. Uh, Rationally, well, let me. I can make a good transition to that part of the story, actually. So I left grad school, and for years I really didn't develop philosophically very much at all. I I knew that I was really dissatisfied with that, with this analytical frame of mind that we're talking about, though. And I was kind of disgusted with it. I have to admit that part of that, it must have been a little bit of bitterness, because, like, even though it was my choice not to continue on in philosophy, it was like a career failure. I kind of needed to just be like, well, that's all just trash, and that's why that's why I stopped. But really, it was like, this isn't taking me anywhere that's helping me. And for me, God ended up being like help that arrived, that I then had to kind of retroactively like find all the rational foundation for, so that my rational mind would give me permission to experience the help that I was being given. And I can go into that. It's a little bit murky, and it's like a long period of time, but I entered. So I lived in Chicago for a few years. I didn't really get up to much. I partied a lot with my roommate, and we sat around watching YouTube videos, and I worked for a moving company, and like I was restoring axes in the basement of this apartment building and selling them on eBay. It was a very strange time. I wasn't really, but I was suffering a lot, and I was damaging myself a lot, really, in isolation and just by being irresponsible with drugs and alcohol. But I eventually, like, the harm of that accumulated to the point where I was suffering quite a lot. And then I met my Lauren, who's now my wife, and I started making a transition from my late prolonged adolescence into something like an adult, like, world where I was going to like have a plan for my life, and we started coming up with this plan to move out here and start a farm, and going through a particularly hard time. Well, so first of all, I got Jordan Peterson. I became aware of him. It was really before his big controversy and stuff, but kind of like just before that. Sorry, my dog is messing around with garbage in the background. And I'd already had that experience with my friends in grad school, who just sort of revealed to me that I was in a kind of shameful way, like just begging the question against Christian people and religious people in general. And I'd had this experience of kind of disillusion with that particular style of philosophy. And then I started like watching Jordan Peterson's classes on YouTube.
How old were
And
you at this time, if I may ask?
so this would have been 2016.
16, I want to say.
Yeah, 2016. So gosh, that means I was 28.
Yeah, it's
28.
just bizarre to me how much like your life and mine line up, and I guess that's probably to a large degree a reflection of, you know, the circumstance that is like we're from the same kind of time and place and culture, but it's just weird like how I can just
Well,
like point by point plot my life alongside yours.
and it is interesting how, because we've kind of come to know each other because we've been kind of sorted through some very good, and I'm glad these filters exist, but we've kind of been sifted
That's
through
exactly
some
what
of,
it is.
you know what I mean? Yeah, so
Like the distributed cognition of like humanity as a whole now with information technology is putting its neurons into contact with each other, you know, based on much more sophisticated sorting mechanisms than it's ever used previously. And so you're very right about that. But yeah, yeah, it was the Jordan Peterson wave was actually starting to crest, and it hadn't broken yet, but
right,
he was uh you know, barreling down
right,
the
right,
horizon. Yeah.
right. Cal, can we pause for just one moment? I
Let's
want
yeah, let's
to.
take a break. Let's take a 5-minute break.
Perfect. That sounds great,
And
actually. Yeah.
okay, let's
I'll pause the recording.
Minecraft.
Oh, I almost got that on record. You were playing. When you say you're playing Minecraft?
I was being a complete parody of myself and playing Minecraft. Um, well, where were we? We were discussing how you were just in a period in your life where kind of things had fallen apart in some sense. Like it was chaotic, but it was you had, but Jordan Peterson was kind of on the horizon, and
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about it, and one thing, like I kind of realized that I quit grad school and I went and I worked for my aunt out in Wyoming, on her ranch for a little while, and I moved out to Chicago, and I kind of realized that instead of studying, so I told you about how I studied physics and math and biology and ended up in philosophy. I should have just been like studying writing, because that was really what I was interested in. I was interested in like story and like I was interested in philosophy as like the background of like a life story. I don't know how to explain it exactly.
I mean that it's just again like having to explain what should make perfect sense, but in our weird society, like has to be explained. But you were into philosophy because you assumed it was relevant to people and their
Yeah,
purposes.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And so and then when I was living in Chicago, I kind of like was kind of like trying to be a nihilist.
Yeah.
Like there's so much of it, and maybe you understand where I'm coming from with this, but like I feel like it's a male thing in our society where it's like you're always trying to like be that guy, you know what I mean? Like I was like trying to be that philosophy teacher guy, and then I moved to Chicago. I was trying to be this like outcast artist guy, and I wasn't doing anything. I was just sitting around smoking pot, and but I ended up meeting this girl, and and we were making plans to like, you know, live in a serious way. Like, you know, we were going to go and be farmers and you know, raise a family and stuff. And so like, it was really serious time. And really what I'm trying to get, it was like, I had to stop trying to like be some like movie guy almost. You know what I mean? It's like in my life story in my head up to that point, I was always trying to like crystallize my role. And instead it was like, oh no, actually you need to like be a person in the world, like living a particular life. And so that's when I discovered Jordan Peterson. And it's funny because I don't really follow him that much anymore. It's not because I had like a falling, like any kind of falling out with him in any way, like something that he did troubled me. But when I think about how many of the things that like define my interests now philosophically are things which he directly introduced me to, and like, because I watched his personality psychology class, I watched his maps of meaning class, I watched like multiple years of it. Like I took it seriously. Like I would watch it, like the current year one when it was coming out. I would watch it and I would take notes, like I was really taking it seriously. And he was, amongst other things, he was taking like Nietzsche seriously. He talked about Dostoevsky, and I really had no understanding of, I was barely aware of, like, I knew that he wrote Crime and Punishment, which I had never read. And now Dostoevsky is like, I don't know. He's like a very dear friend of mine now. But at the time I was completely contemptuous of all that stuff. And he took religion seriously. And I was like, okay, like I've been kind of wanting to figure something out about this, but there's been no avenue into it. Like, if you want to get religious from an analytic background, you become a nihilist. Like that's where it goes if you're going to get human and real about the philosophy. Like it goes to this place where like everything is real, and like really nothing matters. It's not just like nothing matters in that like, oh, we live in a chaotic world where like who can know what their real place in that world is. It's like, no, we inhabit a reality that's just like bursting at the seams with gray horror. Like there is nothing you can do, period.
Yeah, that new atheism is a little bit like, well, it's just a continuation of the Enlightenment project. And what you're saying is, if you follow that project long enough, you realize that like it has to undergo its own deconstruction and terminate in nihilism. And then after that, it's only in that ground that the seed of spirituality can grow.
Or you just die there.
Yeah. You don't psychologically evolve beyond that point.
And I grew up around people who were very like flawed people, but everyone in my life was oriented towards the good. And really now I think of it as being oriented towards God. Even though like my mom and dad were not explicitly religious, like in my deep self, that the love of our family was still very real to me, and that never really got screwed up. In some ways it got it came close to getting screwed up. Like, you know, finding out that your parents are not perfect and are actually maybe have, you know, people with, you know, very real problems that can be traumatic. But I don't feel like I was ever really in danger from nihilism in the way that nihilism really is a serious danger to a lot of people. For whatever reason, I had, and there were people in my mom's family. Her whole family had experienced this horrific car accident when she was a young child, and so from that experience and remaining together as a family, they were always very strong people morally, and good examples. So when I got down into the depths of that, really, I became a kind of insufferable and dramatic person who was doing serious harm to himself. But I was lucky. And I do think about that. And I know that there are, like, I really can't even imagine the condition of nihilism for a person who has also, for instance, experienced practically no, like, deeply positive relationships. Like, that's a seriously horrible idea. And it's killing a lot of people, I think. But like, so, and the realization of that, and just the pointless, you know, the pointlessness of that life, that I thought it would be so, like, free to just be a poor anonymous dude in a big city with no responsibility. But it was, well, a lot of dark seeds got planted in me that didn't need, and it was just because I was bored. I had chosen, like, nothing. But anyway, I lucked out again, and I met a person who actually wanted to, like, plan a life with me, and it was very overwhelming. And so Jordan Peterson also, and like the biggest part of his public message is this very direct and compassionate attention being paid to people who are struggling to find meaning in life. And so that was, like, directly pointed at me. And I was kind of like that demographic. And there are a lot of fun names that have been invented for that demographic online, but the one that always sticks with me, because it was the most hurtful when I heard it, was fail son, which was described as a young white male who has failed to find their place in capitalism. And I was that demographic. Yeah, I can see you've got.
Well, I always kind of assumed the fail son was from something like a more upper middle class background, where it's like he had some standard to, you know, like there was some high, let's say, economic standard that he didn't live up to. And
Right.
I don't know if your parents were, I don't know if they were, like, extremely successful and rich. It
No,
doesn't
far
seem to
from
me
it.
like they were. Kind of seems to me that you're like I don't know, just like an even keel son. You're just kind of at the same level as your parents.
That
But
means a lot to hear that. Yeah.
But I mean, like, I think that might be the I you know, there aren't rigorous definitions for terms like these, and that was always more my own understanding of fail son.
Well,
But
it's interesting though, Cal.
but
It is
you
interesting.
can describe it as like, oh, I didn't find my place in capitalism. It's like,
because where I find the failure in that narrative for me is, and it doesn't fit into that definition that includes capitalism, because for me the failure was moral, because, you know, my parents both did struggle with things and had to persevere, and I had, partly because I had learned this, but partly because I wanted to learn it. I felt like persevering was like a joke, like a boomer joke. Like the real deep person acknowledges that there's no battle to be won, and that it's there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do. And there's nothing you can do in the most profound way of saying that. There's no you, and there's nothing that you that doesn't exist can do or could do.
Yeah, that's why the devil is such a cruel adversary, because he will convince you of that, and then when you're out there failing because it was your understanding that pretending as if there was such a thing as success was a sort of unconscionable mistake, while you're out there failing by default, the devil is going to hurt you with a phrase like, "Oh, now look at you, you're a complete failure, you're a fail son," because that's really how the devil is.
Yeah, well, and that's why that epithet stuck when I heard it, was because I've heard it before. Yeah, I've been saying it like a mantra to myself over and over again for like 15 years. Every step of the way, this has failed, which means you have failed, which means here's a panoramic view of all the potential that was lost. And all
But
the
success
people
would have been working 18 hours a day in a law firm and someday becoming partner, having more money than you know what to do with, and yet having nothing.
Right.
Like so how does one win the game?
Right.
If
Right.
if both failure and success are failure, then
Right. There's nothing you can do. Yeah.
But the devil doesn't want you to even see that. He wants to just put you in that confusion. And then when you're in that confusion, then if he can start taking apart your mind with substances, or just with like bad sleep hygiene, like there's anything to introduce chaos where now you can't even make sense of what's happening around you, like then that's when he can really that's when the fun for him, that's where the fun really begins for Satan. But
yeah so thank goodness for Jordan Peterson. I don't
there
even
was just so
know.
many of us for whom he did the same thing. There was like we all started as like new atheists, and then we realized that culminated in meaninglessness, and Peterson came along and showed us that the way that we were reading scripture, the whole way, our whole literalistic understanding of Christianity was beginning from these flawed premises, and that the real proper starting place for Christianity was the existential condition in which we found ourselves after the Enlightenment project with which we began showed itself to be intellectually bankrupt and morally bankrupt every sense. So yeah, there was
it was enough for me to just really, if I remember, it was enough for me to just hear a smart person say positive things about religious perspective. And that's what I try to tell, because some of my friends at the time were kind of alarmed and appalled at my association with Jordan Peterson, because they were reading about him in the New York Times and stuff. And the thing that I always tried to drive home was that it's like, I don't really even think of Jordan Peterson as being like a thinker, like I think of Nietzsche being a thinker, or Plato being a thinker, or Kierkegaard. Like, I think of him as being like one of my favorite professors. because like my other favorite professors, they enthusiastically and in a way that was directed towards me in like a positive way. Like I'm here to show you some things that might be useful to you, and I actually think that maybe you could make some good use of these, and do something. Like, and watching his lectures reminded me of that feeling again, and I felt just like a completely like a big weight had been lifted up. But shortly after that, some very negative things happened in my life, and my at the time girlfriend, she's now my wife, but at the time we ended up separating because I was not handling it well, and I'm glad that I had exposure to his sort of affirming, but it wasn't really enough, and I was just like in chaos, like what you were describing, like Satan's playground, where just who knows from moment to moment what kind of terror is going to be there. But I was lucky because I had learned from Jordan Peterson that like suffering is a thing that like a lot of people experience, and that there are ways of fighting it. That's very important to believe that. And I didn't really believe that before. I kind of thought that like suffering was the thing that correct understanding brings on a person, and it sort of makes you more deep. You know what I mean? It's like the suffering artist is like full of this horrible truth, and like if they're going to continue to be authentic, they're going to be suffering. But I kind of started calling out in my heart. And one time I asked out loud, I was like, is there even any possibility that I'm strong enough to survive? And I felt and saw like a golden like arrow that was just like surging up, and it was, I remember at the time, like my first thought was like, you are not going to believe that this happened. Like very soon you're not going to be able to convince yourself that you experienced something like this in this way. But it was a very simple feeling. It was not like a vision. It was like somebody saying, like, of course, like there's so much strength that's just right here, and you just have to ask. Like it's just right here, here, and it, like I survived that happening, that time, and I reconciled with Lauren, and and now we're here. Like we started a farm and a business together. Like things went the right way. And the problem was healed. And once again, it's like I had never been really tested before in that way, and so I haven't had the experience of going through something like that and it not working out, except in very like minor ways with like previous relationships. It had never been like my life has been torn apart. But the one time that has really happened, I had a friend, and that was when it really got serious, where I was really like, holy cow, like I think I actually might like believe in something. And you've got to understand where, because it still is, like talking about it right now, I'm like, how are you talking? You can't talk like that. You can't talk about God like that, or about like feelings like that. Like that's all stuff that like weird, like evangelicals, like that's all like, that's like church people. Like still like in my deep like dispositions, just from habit, it's hard to like admit that kind of thought or experience into my life. Still, do you kind of know what I mean? But from that point on, I was on a trajectory spiritually, and I started to like admit that to other people. But it wasn't Christianity for a long time. It was still, well, it feels like a long time. For like 2 or 3, sorry, my dogs are running by. For like 2 or 3 years at least. So we moved out here on my 30th birthday. And I love living out here in the country. There's still been a lot of like challenges, just because like I'm living my life in a very different context than it's ever been lived before. Where, like I'm in charge of things, and like I have to like be responsible, and like the future hangs in the balance. But I've also been very isolated, and that's had good and bad features. One of the bad features is that when you're alone, you're not really alone. And so I had a number of experiences, spiritual experiences that were evil in character. I don't indulge in trying to figure out what relationship my experiences have to the powers and principalities mentioned in the Bible. That's been a kind of a bad road for me to try to go down in my mind, and figuring out if I've interacted with demons or whatever. But I had negative experiences that were sufficiently evil in character to make me think that way. And it was because I was by myself, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, with a lot of time on my hands, and choosing to spend that time in as isolated a way as possible. So I have in the past had bad experiences where I was sort of inundated with unwanted imagination. And I began to experience okay, so here's I think how it happened. I was struggling with this idea that I was a believer, I live in a kind of a Christian part of the country. I mean, it's rural America, so it's a Christian part of the country. So I am around a lot of Christian believers who believe in a very kind of traditional American Christian worldview. I was trying to understand if maybe I was becoming a Christian, and if that was because of the people I was around, or if there was some deeper reason. And around that time, I began to have unwanted experiences of images of close members of my family being tormented in hell because my family are not in any way like traditional Christian believers. I think my mom may identify in some ways with Christian faith, but I don't know if she would identify as a Christian. The question that was sort of forced on me was, if you're going to believe this way, you're going to need to believe that these things are going to happen. And that it's good. That was the really terrifying element of it. And then that drove me away from any kind of desire to be associated with a traditional Christian framework. But then I began to, for some reason, think in terms of Lewisian modal realism again. And then it was like the suggestion was, in fact, your connection to this transcendent mode of being, what that reveals is this kind of truth, and the key phrase what was that nothing constrains reality. Nothing constrains reality. So let me show you then what's true. And the upshot of it is something like universal damnation. Like
I can't believe what I'm hearing. This is crazy. This is so much like the devil. And this is like so well articulated. Something similar things occurred to me, like these intrusive thoughts, but like this is just like I have no way to describe like how I'm reacting to this right now. But I'm sorry if I interrupted your
no, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad that it's making sense. But
it's making all too much sense. This is such classic diabolism, like such classic Satan chess.
Yeah, and it was like the final choice of it was
it's like, if God can exist, then nothing's off the table, my friend. And you allowed this thought into your mind. So now you have to entertain it.
And more than that, like if you want love to survive, love this. Like you can love the betrayal of your close loved one. Like here's a way you could do it.
In fact, you must. Piety requires that you
a person who's close to me would reveal a disgust for maggots. And the word maggots would mean you will one day need to learn to love how terrified this person can be made of maggots. Here's how you can learn. because that is, and in my mind, that is, if you're going to believe what David Lewis believed about the plurality of worlds, and you're going to maintain some kind of grip on reality in any human way, you're going to have to accept that everything is good. Everything that could exist in your mind is good. Because that's what, yeah. So, but the thing that it made me realize, and that's why, so it was very horrible. And this was like a picture show. It was not like a lecture.
Indeed,
I never
it
heard,
couldn't have been a lecture.
I never heard.
It was too deep to be a lecture.
Yeah. But it was paralyzed. It was hideous. I can't even really, it's difficult for me to even talk about it because like there's an element of my personality that says like, you're making this up. Like this, because, but I know, because at the time I remember feeling that way about it and thinking, you have to try to remember this because you are later going to be incapable of believing that. But I mean, there was a day that I was so stricken with this that I was almost unable to go into work. And then when I did go in, I either that time or some subsequent time, like at work, at the library, I was just shown among the most atrocious things that have been part of my experience. And that's true. I remember how stricken I was.
My friend Nate taught me this, that Rudolf Steiner said that there are two forms of deception. There's the Ahrimanic deception, says that there is no spiritual or transcendent dimension of existence. And then there's the Luciferian deception, which acknowledges that there is a spiritual dimension to reality, but which substitutes some extravagant lie for the truth. And the thing is, the way the devil operates is that he uses both of these lies simultaneously. And the right hemisphere of your mind, which is out there on the rim of what you can understand, which is really in touch with spiritual reality, is telling you something true. And then the left side of your brain is going to come in and say, just, you're exaggerating it. This is nothing. It's from nothing. You're a drama queen. Like, what is this? You're dramatizing your own existence in order to make it interesting, when in fact it's just terminally boring and you're nothing. And so these are the two sides of the satanic dialogue. Yes. And the thing is, but that when you have the intuition about the unspeakable horror of damnation, it's like that was 100% real and meaningful. And I know that because I had my own struggle in which the exact same things were occurring, where I was experiencing things that were extremely real, on the spiritual dimension of reality. And always there was a side of me which wanted to reduce it to mere mental illness. And I know now how it's the devil's game, and you can tell that because you can't win, because either way, whichever one you succumb to, if you were to say that, oh yeah, it was just illusion and the spiritual dimension of reality is not real, you're going to be right back at that place where things make no sense at all.
Yeah.
And then you're just going to be fair game for the next explosion of horrific imagery and phantasmagoria. Yeah. And the cycle just repeats indefinitely until you are broken down into, madness. The disintegration of human souls is the devil's what's the word I want? It's his sport. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, like that's crazy. But like on another level, I can understand where it's coming from, because it's like if you're a Christian, then yeah, you believe that eternal damnation is what's going to happen to all your near and dear who don't believe. Um, and if you are to be a good and pious Christian, you must approve of it, because God is perfect justice.
Right.
It
Well,
is
and
perfect justice which requires that finite sins be punished infinitely. For me personally, I seem to see satanic logic in that syllogism too.
well,
Um,
it's a very effective way of preventing people from entering Christianity from the outside. Because unless you can come into Christianity with all of your family, uh, it requires you to choose to accept. Well, I'm not saying that Christianity in fact does this, but if that lie is true, then to be a Christian, you have to send your mom and your dad and your friends, you have to send them to hell in your mind.
oh, but what if that's just what Jesus meant when he said, better to pluck out your eye or cut off your hand
Right,
and go into heaven maimed than go into Gehenna hale and whole.
right. Yeah. Well,
I'm being the devil's advocate here, but because in reality, I believe that with David Bentley Hart, that that these people, however flawed or evil they might be, they're actually, these people, they're part of your extended
well,
self, and that you're not
so
hidden
here's
without these relationships, and that if you do have to sacrifice these relationships in order to gain entry to heaven, you've done
right.
so at the expense of your own humanity.
But here's how that, in my experience, it's like I I could pluck out the eye that that I would need to pluck out. So I could throw my dad into hell. But when I hear uh, before you tend to the speck in your brother's eye, remove the log from your own, I hear my dad's voice, and so that has to go away. And when I think about home and love, I remember them, and so it seems like to apply that scripture in that way, uh, I'm being asked to enter into heaven as something unrecognizable. And I don't know how I could possibly accept that. It doesn't seem possible to me, especially when I can understand that scripture as applying to my body in a much more straightforward way, because there are parts of my body, there are parts of my brain, there are parts of my habit that are vice gripped tight to hell and that I need to be shed of. That seems to me to be a teaching from the Spirit of God, that you can cut those things free and come home. Not that bow before me and accept the twisted, agonized, burning flesh of your home and family, because otherwise I'm sending you there too. And that's what, because the madness of these questions and these things that I was being shown, it finally was, I had to say that I don't really know what the truth of any of this is. All I know is that what, if nothing constrains reality, then my will says that home and love and truth is real, and I'm going to just say that. And if I have to be in hell, that's what I'll try to do, because it's all that, it's something has to constrain this. So if there's nothing else to do it, that effort can have my will.
Who is it says that as long as there's anyone still in hell, then Christ is there? Or like if the true Christian saint says that if someone is in hell, then shouldn't I go there too? To try and bring them out, or at least be there with them. That's
George MacDonald. Yeah, he said, you know,
see, that's like
what real Christian spirit wouldn't walk across an eternal desert to just bring a handful of water to the lips of someone suffering down there.
And it's like, finally, in that expression, you have Christianity, because otherwise it's just freaking power relations, man. You're just doing it because the big sky dad says, I'm going to torture you forever if you don't.
Right. And if you have the power to do that to me, and you are willing to do that to me, unless I give up my whole frame of reference,
whole moral frame of reference,
I can't give that up. It would be death. It would be a different thing.
It would be sacrificing the real God for a false God.
Yes. So, and now I don't know exactly what the timeline, because that was a very crazy time. But it became a lot easier for me to think of myself as being a Christian, and at some point I just started thinking of myself that way.
It's crazy to me, like how, like, I think if there is a sensus divinitatis, then that's what it is. It's and God in some sense is the reality principle. He is the constraint on what is. Because, you know, like against Lewis, I would say with Wittgenstein, if some worlds are, then some worlds aren't. In order to let things be, there has to be a constraint on reality, and God is that. But he's something else in addition to that. Like in the movie A Beautiful Mind, John Nash's wife, John Nash suffers from schizophrenia, and, you know, in some sense for him there's no constraint on reality. And his wife says, what if the part that discerns the waking from the dream isn't here but here? Because in my own case, when I came to God pre-rationally, before I even said I believed in God, it was a thing which came to me, and all it told me was that basically love exists. There was no reference to an afterlife, and you have to do this because otherwise you're going to burn in hell or whatever. It just told me in so many words that love exists, and you're never cut off from it. You're never disinherited from it, no matter what you do. And you always have the option to act it out, and to be its vehicle. And that, because so many times in what you've been saying, I've been wanting to ask you, like, who is God to you, and where is he, what is he, and you know, and what basis do you, on whose authority and on what basis do you claim that this love exists, if not the Bible, which says, or seems to say, so we are told, that perfect love requires something morally unimaginable, And but you're not getting this from David Lewis, and you're certainly not getting this from Dennett or Dawkins. So from whom are you getting this? Uh, you know, uh, uh, it's like, come clean. Like what is, whoever told you that God exists and that He is good? It's like,
Right. I identify very strongly with what you were just expressing about your own experience, because I had to, because those, so when you're putting yourself in that interrogative mode there, that voice, so I would have these periods of strife, and who God was the help that would arrive at the end, so that I could actually come out of it and come back to the world and live my life without being in desperate straits all the time. But then this questioning would start, and it was like, well, okay, so you clearly need to believe that positive end of that experience that you've just survived is in some sense deeply real. And you are identifying that feeling with the expression present in religion, and specifically in Christianity, which is the religious tradition that you're sort of most proximal to. Is there any reason for us to accept this as anything more than just a expedient solution to a serious issue of mental illness? And that would, at first, the easy solution to that voice is to just kind of admit, yeah, I think I was just going through something. But then the question opens up, okay, well, then what, at what state is our belief then?
that's crazy. This is another thing that I wanted to ask you and that I didn't. But you said that at this time I started believing in God and admitting it in conversation with people. And I wanted to ask you, what made you cop to that? What made you admit that and be understood as somebody's fool, rather than continue to let it be known that you're too smart to fall for such childish lies?
Well, part of it is just because I started to feel a little bit incensed by anyone who showed contempt for like a belief in God, because I knew now that I could sort of be indexed as a person who has had those sorts of beliefs. But then part also is just how important it was, and how because from the moment I started having these, I don't criticize other people's like religious orientation anymore, and I'm happy to hear that a person has belief, because I know that whatever that belief is, from a objective perspective, it at least provides them with maybe some comfort from these particular kinds of, because one of the things that came back to me again and again as I was undergoing these experiences was I never even knew how bad a person could feel. Like I never knew how horridly evil a thought could be before I considered the possibility of, like, one of my childhood dogs being tormented in hell forever, for instance. Just that thought alone, and the possibility of that thought, was so horrible. Coming from a background where, like, at least people die, like at least your pain ends when you die. So part of me
What
wanted,
fascinates me about what you've told me so far, and pardon me for so many interruptions, if you can believe it, it's just an expression of my tremendous interest. But in the beginning of what you told me, when you were sort of in that new atheist intellectual current, you wanted to lead people away from religion because their own belief in hell and eternal damnation was causing them so much unnecessary misery. Then fast forward, I don't know, 10, 12, 14 years.
yeah.
It's like suddenly you're there. What's going on?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's still so surreal to even admit that.
I find it totally surreal too. I find it totally surreal that because this God in whom I now believe, I formerly only ever knew under childish descriptions, or it was only as a child that I believed in God, and now suddenly this entity is too small a word, but suddenly this force and this reality are back in the picture. And yeah, I almost dissociate over that. Sort of like how as a child I would have moments of profound stupefaction, incomprehension. What, this person exists? So my brother, like his name is this. So almost like when you forget how to spell the word they call it semantic satiation, where suddenly the radical contingency of things is borne in upon you, and
Right.
and you no longer take for granted something. The arrangement of whose circumstances is
Yeah.
rather improbable when you scrutinize it objectively.
Yeah.
But it's like sometimes I do have that moment of dissociation. What, you mean that dream I had when I was a child, this kind of fantasy, you mean that is real? I don't see
Yeah.
any God here.
Right.
All I see is a parking lot.
Right. It's ordinary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, I mean, I've been thinking recently, and it's like my experience of Christianity, at least so far, has been a period of some of the most terribly negative emotions I've ever experienced. That's something I think some people fail to understand about religion, is that it's some kind of like uh, all-purpose balm that just like removes. I think some people accept a certain form of religion that is kind of that, which is just sort of everything's hunky dory. You don't need to worry about it because it's all taken care of. But my experience so far has, while I don't, obviously I still identify as a Christian, and more than ever, but it's not been a pleasant experience. I'm still very early on in my. I'm not where I need to end up. At least, God willing, I have a chance to continue on learning. But there's a constant feeling that intrudes into these thoughts. That's just like, the way you're feeling and thinking right now is not the ordinary way, and this is disconnected from you. And who are you now? And like, I don't know. Sometimes I don't know how to relate to like a movie that I used to enjoy from 10 years ago. Now I might watch it and have some kind of disquieting problem with some like sex act that's being depicted, because my outlook on sex is different than it was 10 years ago. It's very disorienting.
What I would say to you, I'm sorry if this is intrusive or like not quite in the rhythm or the melody of what you've been saying, but if God is love, then by that fact you know that Jesus is his son. And when you don't understand yourself or your situation or anything at all, and when it all is, it threatens to come apart as like this kind of, horrifying meaninglessness, jesus Jesus beckons, and you don't know who he is or how he can be human and God, but you enter into that mystery. That's the time when, because I mean, you can offer some pretty nice proofs that God exists, but
Right.
um like I don't know how the hell that gives you Jesus, and that
Exactly.
he was a a Jew from the first century, and he actually came back
I
to
used
life
to
from the
ask
tomb.
my Christian friends about that in grad school. I was like, well, even if I accept this argument, like the ontological argument, I could never make sense of it really. But I was like, okay, well, even if I accept the conclusion, um, like we're I'm not Christian. Like there's still like an unending ocean of possibility, like what this could mean. And they weren't able to explain it to me. But I understand it now. I understand it now. Um, it's why I have such a hard time. Like I haven't really talked to either of my parents uh, about this change, this big change that's occurred to me. But it's partly because I don't have any idea how to really express it. Like I don't know how to bring it into their frame of reference. And probably what I would find, and when I inevitably do, because I love my parents very much, and I'll find that there probably are points of reference um, that they can identify. But yeah, it's like there was a leap, there was a gap that I got through or over, and it was like entering an atmosphere in a space capsule. It was like, and then now here I am, and I would I would go looking for. I finally started to actually sort of go looking for some like arguments about this stuff, because I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to identify as Christian, I should at least like know something about this, and like maybe there are like arguments that it's rational to think in this way. Like maybe there's something. Well, it turns out that there are a ton of there's like and there's like a mountain of rational justification that exists if that's your taste. And I have periodically had to go back and learn more about arguments for the existence of God, or arguments for the historicity of Jesus, or any of these sort of what I think of as being rational stumbling blocks. The role of philosophy in my life has completely changed to being like, rather than looking at religion as being some kind of like panacea for like pain I'm not willing to accept, I look at philosophy much in that way much more now. It's like when I am troubled by this questioning voice, it is good to have philosophy to fall back on. And finally, the final crisis, and this is shortly before I met you. I had stayed up all night because the phantasmagoria was back, and like now it was like, well, you're a Christian now, so you remember that YouTube video that you recently watched? It's a prominent fairly prominent. I mean, there are all these weird corners of Christian YouTube. I don't know how to navigate the world of Christian culture at all. I'm almost a total outsider still. But like, I saw this video of a guy talking about hell. He was dispensing with the myth that C.S. Lewis was a universalist by talking about how in The Great Divorce, after darkness falls in hell, that's when they'll come out. And he smiled. And I couldn't, like, the smile that came up onto his face, I was like, what have I fallen in league with? Like, and then it was like, no, this is what you have to accept now. This is a smart guy. He's got a big beard and he's on YouTube. He's got a lot of people listen to this guy. And I was once again just so lost. And I was like, forgot, because in my mind so I read David Lewis, no, I'm sorry, I read C.S. Lewis. It's funny, David Lewis and C.S. Lewis are like right next door to each other on my bookshelf.
I was thinking that as well.
But The Great Divorce really helped me, because I never want to place myself above other people. I don't, and so I was like, you can't just like throw out everything that everybody says about hell because it's unpleasant to you, because what you're saying is that you are more in connection with God, or you are a deeper Christian, or you're a better thinker than these people. And I read The Great Divorce, and for a lot of people, I think it has the same effect, where it's like, okay, I can understand this doctrine from a different perspective that isn't so crude and about retribution, and it's more about the human psychology and the psychology of evil and stuff. But then, I mean, even with the rather hopeful conclusion of that, and even though from that book, I was exposed to George MacDonald for the first time, there was still this element where I was like, no, I think we've got to still believe this. And then I saw that video and the smile on that guy's face, and for whatever reason, that was like, I was right back in the mix, where it's like, nope, this is what this means, and you're gonna have to see this, and you're going to know when you see this happening that it's good.
See, again, for whatever it's worth, just my 2 cents, and it's only really occurred to me now, after hearing you say all that you said. There's the God that you can understand. You can derive him from philosophy, or you can derive him from the Bible. And if you want that God, it's relatively easy to get there. Not totally easy. The devil can still throw some stumbling blocks along that way and perpetrate the Arianic deception on you, if he finds the opportunity to do so. But it's relatively easy to reach that shore. But that God that you understand, call him God the Father, but understood as like the divine clockmaker, that God cannot save you. Christ is the God that you do not understand. And it's like only that God can save you. And only that God is actually the image of the Father. But I would submit that there's no cut and dried algorithm, or cookie cutter approach that is going to just give you Jesus, give you that living mystery fully defined.
Even having like an attachment to, because it's like, even at the beginning of The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis is like, this is just a fantasy. I'm not even trying to speculate about what the afterlife is like, and I don't like that. But even with that, even remembering that, if you attach and are sucked into this particular person's thought, and you come out of it like having identified with so much of it, and you think like, well, now this is what I have to be a part of. Like, that is a mistake. It's a mistake ever to identify God with any picture that you've ever contained in your mind. So yes, I that's very important.
And that was a point which C.S. Lewis himself made many times. And then I have that same issue reading Lewis, not necessarily about his views on hell, but you know, sometimes I feel like I come away reading, because I love C.S. Lewis. I loved him when I was an atheist, and I had read like half his works already as an atheist. But sometimes I come away feeling too identified with his position, and it's one which I don't fully agree, because I have my own conception. But of course, I wouldn't claim that my own conception of God is the final
Right.
representation of God, and so, but yeah, no, I completely get what you're saying.
But that night, I stayed up all night because I saw this guy smile. And then I was because I had convinced myself that because C.S. Lewis changes George MacDonald to say that you shouldn't be a universalist. I mean, he more or less explicitly has George MacDonald's like recant his universalism, which, you know, I love that book, but I really don't like that he did that with George MacDonald. But that's kind of a separate discussion. I had sort of put the idea of universalism out of my mind on purpose. I was like, okay, that's self-indulgent for you to think that you get to believe that. But finally that night, I was like, I'm gonna search YouTube for universalism. Maybe there'll be somebody. I had sort of I had associated it with very touchy-feely, warm, positive emotion Christianity, which I distrust for being too frothy, kind of like. But I found a David Bentley Hart interview, and I listened to about 40 seconds of it, and then I went and downloaded his book on it, and I listened to it that day. Just listened to. I was sitting and performing various chores, and just totally. And the wonderful thing about that book, That All Shall Be Saved, is that it is not an emotionally driven book about how terrible the beliefs are. He touches on that here and there, but it's mostly just a rather dry, kind of incredulous, like slightly incredulous that it's even an issue, thorough and rational argument. And after I finished that, I felt I felt okay being a Christian. I was like, I'm a Christian. Because it's okay for me to, because this is a position that you can hold, not just because you're hysterical, but because it's a deep tradition in the church. I can just enter into this conversation as somebody identifying with this side of things. I'm on team Christianity. And then I started to actually like read the Bible more seriously. And from the perspective that I got from that book, I read the Gospels, and I just didn't find hell in there anymore. Because I was able to understand that it's like the way, like you look at the parable of the sheep and the goats, you can only understand that the way it's taught if you've been taught that way, because it's a parable. It's a story about sheep and goats. Like he doesn't.
I think that's the correct interpretation. Ultimately, is to say that this is a parable. It's part of a set of mutually contradictory images from which we should understand that, you know, Jesus wasn't laying down the definitive teaching on hell when he was offering these. But if you want to get hard-nosed or if you want to approach this in a sort of you know, technical or objective fashion, you know, what I would say is, you know, the way the argument usually goes is aionios. Okay, well, let's grant for the sake of argument that aionios means what it says, of the age, i.e., not eternal. It's pertaining to an age. Yet, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, aionios is applied to the life and the punishment, the life of the sheep, the punishment of the goats. Therefore, we should understand that unless this word is being equivocated in the same verse, the punishment of the goats is eternal because the life you have in Christ is eternal. The problem there is that if you go to 1 Corinthians 15:22, as in Adam all died, so in Christ all will be made alive. Either we accept that a quantifier can be equivocated in the same verse, or we just have a straight up contradiction, because Matthew 25 teaches eternal hell, and 1 Corinthians 15:22 teaches universal salvation. So it's like I don't know if that's useful for you to hear or not, because like on some level I've been saying that, like, you know, I think there's good reasons to believe that God exists. I think there's good reasons to believe in universal salvation, but in some level, gosh, it's the same mistake to say that, this is going to sound so weird, but if concluding that God doesn't exist because he can't be proven scientifically is a mistake, then it's like the same mistake to assume that universalism can't be true because I can't find like the kind of straightforward Bible study sort of approach for it. It's like, this is something, in order to see its truth, you have to see with your heart.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, if you keep relying on your head and not your heart, then it's like you still don't trust God to be who he says he is. It's like, I'm the best thing ever, I'm the best thing you can conceive, I am
well, and you end up having all kinds of thoughts about equivocation and translation, and I mean, instead of deriving comfort from your religion, instead of like understanding something about your life that needs to change, like, it's a story he told people, and this is something that Sherry pointed out to me. This is a story that he told people who knew sheep and goats on a day-to-day basis as part of their essential livelihood. And that's the level that I want to experience his teaching at, is the level where he is telling me that there are important distinctions to be made about what you do and how you relate to other people. There are important choices to be made about that. And my role is to gather you up and show you where to go on a path, not in a direction, but on a path. That's where you walk and you go in your life. And the rational stuff, the arguments, and because I can do that and I learned how to do it, it's a big like part of my brain that gets a lot of sway. And I need I don't need it, but it is so expedient and helpful and useful to have the permission of that part of my brain to listen to the teachings of Jesus. And I stumble, I get tripped up when I either ignore or try to negotiate with that part of my brain. And so I really, in moments of deep, what I would describe as the moments of deep faith that I'm even capable of, I'm still very early on. I know I have a strong sense that I'm very early on in my understanding of this stuff. But the deepest I get with it is when once that stuff is shut up and I can just pay attention to, I don't know, the stuff that takes your breath away and makes you silent. And after I listened to that David Bentley Hart book, I have not really engaged with any like theological struggling. I listened to George MacDonald all the time, the LibriVox recordings of unspoken sermons. I listened to those. And I think in the way that comes most naturally to me in terms of simple, like the simple human story of Jesus, because that's the level at which I relate to him as a friend, is as the absolute like clarity of the reality and significance of life that I get from the idea that I could see him walking down a road. And all the metaphysical framework, the very, very deep and beautiful idea of what that it meant for him to be a man and be God, that's present in my mind as a kind of like crystal that's beautiful and that I know was like walking, like that had shoes on and was walking like, and that, so it's like that's why I identify so strongly with so many of the people that you've introduced me to, because it seems to be like this uncanny like meeting point of, because there's a lot of very deep theology that I've been exposed to through you and through Luke and Nate, but there's also this like urgent, immediate appreciation of like just the here and now-ness of all of it. And that's the part that is so important. And it's really like, that's like the religion to me, is it like puts me in life. I don't have to be objective about life.
And it's not abstract anymore. It takes form. It takes a concrete
Yes.
and physical form. And the form that it is the hand that reaches above the water. As you're drowning underneath the water, the form that it takes is the hand of Jesus that you clasp onto and that lifts you out.
Yeah.
It all crystallizes and you know, takes form, you know, in that way.
But I really don't know how I arrived at the point where I'm accepting things in these terms.
I don't either.
It's and we were talking about this. We were talking about doing this talk, and I was worried about it because I just don't know how to explain. I don't know how it happened at all. Like even tracing back through that story, it seems to me like there's a crucial like element in there that I'm not. But honestly, it doesn't bother me at all.
Something under the surface that you must have missed, because I still can't make any final sense of this picture. Let me tell you how I started believing in Jesus. I was just reading a lot of the Bible and listening to and navigating Christian YouTube for reasons I couldn't articulate to myself. It was just a compulsion. I was in speech therapy grad school. I would come back after my classes and practicum exhausted, and then I would just be just searching this stuff compulsively. And I listened to a video of Doug Wilson saying that he was explicating the theology of Jonathan Edwards, and he said that Jesus is God. Jesus is God's idea. Jesus is God's idea of himself. And after I heard those words, if you had asked me, do you believe that Jesus is God? Because that was the whole thing I couldn't get my mind around. I could believe in the God of the Old Testament as really just the, God as the reality principle and nothing more, the brute stipulation of what is and what must be accepted. And yes, it's like chaotic and terrible sometimes, and that's just the capricious nature of Yahweh. Deal with it. I could believe in that God, but not the God who actually touchy-feely cares about you, becomes a human, gets nailed to a cross. What is that? And then after Doug Wilson said that, if you'd asked me, I would say, I don't believe that. I don't believe Jesus is God. But I went outside and I was nauseated, and I was just smoking cigarette after cigarette, which doesn't help nausea, but because I did believe it. I don't know why. I don't know why I believed it after he said that. But after that, I believed in Jesus. And I prayed to Jesus, well, if you're real, I guess if I had read and I forgot, thou shalt not put your God to the test. I said, well, if you're real, take this from me. And he did. And even after that, I still didn't believe. And there are times when you ask me to make sense of the incarnation, I find that that's the greatest and most difficult part. And it's precisely like this is why Christianity is true and not merely some religion which I can wrap my mind around. Because in this Jesus, there is the true God, as opposed to my own concept of God.
Yeah,
I thank you so much for your time, because you were able to articulate so much better than I the I mean, it's incredible. I can't verbalize it the way that you did. But Jesus walking on the road, Jesus on the road to Emmaus, and that his disciples, they don't recognize him. And Jesus tells them of all the places in the Old Testament that his coming was heralded, but in whose hermeneutic was this properly interpreted and deduced? Not that of the rabbis. The rabbis are reading the Bible the right way. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son. That's a mistranslation from the Septuagint. Alma just means a young woman in the Hebrew. Um, uh, there, you know, the Messiah, he's gonna be totally spiritualized, and he's not gonna have an earthly kingdom. That's not the Messiah on whom we wait. This is a false theology. And I think the only way you can really derive Jesus is with the hermeneutic of love. It takes a different hermeneutic. It's not a Sunday school hermeneutic. Because if it were, then it wouldn't be, the Bible wouldn't be for sons of God. If it were just to spoon feed us the answer, then it would just be for servants or automatons.
right.
But it's there because it's the way it is, because you have to wrestle with it. And ultimately, your theology has to be, in my opinion, it has to be derived based on considerations of God's nature. It's not based on, I think the author's intent at this time and place to this audience was this, and he could not have envisaged anything like a Trinity, because historically it would be an anachronism to read that concept back in there. No, it's like the way that you decide what it means is based on like the highest conception that you can form of the goodness of God's nature. And
Yes.
and George MacDonald does that, and he's like kind of the only guy who does that, and like that's why, yeah.
I go back again and again and again and again. Like it's like a it's funny because even his name, George MacDonald, it makes me think of like an old like Scottish castle. And that's what I feel like. I feel like it's like I listen to unspoken sermons and it's like I go back into this like mossy like stone castle where it's like silent, and I listen to I listen to him talking, and I remember, okay, this is why I'm a Christian, and this is what the doing of that is. Like, this is how you feel it in your heart. And it's the only like form of Christianity that makes me want to do something, like that makes me want to keep going, as opposed to making me want to, just like forget about it. Just like one way or the other, just let me have a bit of peace right now. So like smarter people will decide it. No, it's like, the nature of God is unknowable, and so you which means that like knowing it would mean you were something new. And so it's the approaching to that, and that to me is what is it? It's like it's spiritual movement, which is manifest as it manifests as thoughts and as images and a feeling and a relationship. And it's almost corny, because people have turned it into like a catchphrase of like evangelicalism, like the personal relationship with Christ. But it's like you need a human friend to help you, and that's what he is.
That's so much realer than any god of the philosophers.
Yeah, right. You need a person who understands that you are suffering and flawed, but that you're trying to like build a house you can actually live in, and somebody who actually wants you to have a place to live and to have peace. And that's the leaping from the ontological argument to Christianity that I really can't explain, because it's so essential to me now, essential in a practical way. Like I had better not let go of that, or I'm going to lose touch once again with everything that's really been valuable, the only valuable things that have ever been in my life.
And I myself, I lose touch with that so often. And and in some sense, every time that I lean on my own understanding, then I've actually fallen, and I'm no longer standing in
because
faith.
What one person has a worldview put together for themselves that makes sense. Like it's narcissistic for me. Like it's like there's a part of me that really thinks I'm so smart that if in some particular moment I just can't figure it out, or I can't remember why it's true, that actually makes a difference, that actually means something. But I know that it doesn't. I was being honest with myself and my memory, and the fact that I'm not like some like towering thinker. Somehow in my you come to represent the ultimate authority in your own mind.
It is itself some weird philosopher's dream that the edifice of Christianity should, at the end of the day, rest on nothing more than one's own mental efforts, and that God needs you to prove his existence in order for him to exist.
instead of the acknowledgement that, like, just thank God that I had some kind of tool at my disposal that allowed me to claw my way, like, towards something genuinely good. And you start judging the product by the faulty tools that only did like 10% of the real work.
Yeah.
So yeah, oh my gosh, it's exhausting.
Yeah, it is. It's I'm mindful of your time.
Right. Yeah.
Because I've had you explaining yourself for going on, well, over 3 hours now.
Well, yeah, I do need to, I need to be wrapping up. But I kind of got through the whole story, really.
I think we did.
The part of the story that's left out, which deserves to be mentioned, because it's a crucial part of the story, is that I was vaguely aware of Paul. His name's Paul Vanderklay, right?
Vanderklay.
Yeah. I had that thing where you're about to mention a name you've hardly ever spoken out loud, and you're like, is that the real Paul Vanderklay? I enjoy his content a lot, but I just happened to hear him mention a Discord, and I don't even know. I've never been on Discord or downloaded Discord, or I went on Discord, and I mentioned a couple things about myself in introduction, and I kind of made a vaguely universalist gesture, and a firestorm erupted.
Triggered an immediate flame war.
I was immediately out of the conversation. Like I was just watching it happen. But you very kindly messaged me out of nowhere, and through you, I've grown to know a number of people, especially I would say Sherry and Nate and Luke, and Kenneth is Nate's son, right?
Kenneth, yes.
Kenneth isn't Nate's grandfather. I hope Kenneth sees that joke. But that has been just having the opportunity to just listen to, because I can't tell you how isolated this whole experience has been from anybody. But being able to talk about it and just listen to other people struggle and articulate brilliantly sometimes, it's made a world of difference. It was another sort of leveling up,
absolutely,
gap leaping. Thank you very much for that. It was a real stroke of grace in my life. It was like I dipped into the Discord and all this chaos erupted, and you literally you swooped in like on a giant eagle and like swooped out of the Discord.
No, that's hilarious because I do remember that day, and I remember that Dave Williams basically put out the bat signal. And
I forgot that Dave Williams was even involved. So now I know.
Did I have said his name? Are we allowed to say? I think so.
We can bleep it out.
I don't think he likes to show. Perhaps I don't think he likes to show his face in videos. But I hope that saying his name is okay, because then he's on the Discord and a lot of people there watch these videos. But anyway, if it needs to be edited out, we can do that. Yeah, he put out one of our friends put out the bat signal, and that just meant I don't know, get into a pointless debate. It was, I don't know, like, and so we did, but yeah.
Whether or not he likes his name mentioned, I was remiss not to mention Dave before, because he and I agree that there should be an entirely animated remake of Lord of the Rings. And that's a very important opinion that I have. But yeah, Dave has also been. But yeah, that entire group of people, and all you guys' content too. I haven't had time to. You guys actually generate a lot of content. But gosh, it's such a blessing. It's such a blessing. It's such a relief, because it was kind of like that filter thing we were talking about before. It was like and it was another level of narcissism where I assumed that that like I was just a crazy person, sort of tearing myself to shreds, and
Yeah, nobody else gets it.
But really, it's like even the experiences I had with evil, like it's so remarkable to me how many people are surviving that kind of thing, and much worse, and coming to, even if it's not like universalism, or because I'm not sure that
Yeah, because they're not all universalists on Luke's server, and it's not really a core issue.
no,
But the
it's
common
something
common
else.
thread is that for that kind of Christianity is what Jess would call a U-shaped journey sort of Christianity.
Yeah,
It's you only get that kind of Christianity after some kind of deconstruction, and all of us went through that. That would be the commonality.
right, right. Yeah, it's been so well, great. It's been enlivening. So and it's made me a lot more optimistic in general about just, because it's tough. It is a tough world right now. It's a difficult time that we're experiencing as a civilization, but yeah, it's not all bad.
No, I think that's a great note to end on, and I'm very grateful for your time. And after we stop recording, we can talk about what we want to do with this recording. But thank you to anyone who watched and listened, and thank you again very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Cal, and thanks again for everything. Okay.